Good morning, everyone. Welcome to DevOps FW Days, and welcome to this first session of the day. My name is Alex Thissen. I'm from the Netherlands. I work at Xspirit, and we help companies build better software in a faster way. And one of the things that we do is practice DevOps with the teams that we work with the customers. And today's session, we'll talk about how feature flags can help you continuously release your software and provide business value whenever you want to. Let's get started with what we want to achieve. Because when you practice DevOps, it's being able to release multiple times per day. Sometimes companies can only do that once every 3 months, or it takes a long time for them to release their new software. But you want to move fast, be business agile, try new stuff and see how it works in production. So being able to continuously deploy to production is something that you would want to achieve. That way you can always release new stuff. You would never have to roll back because you're able to deploy to production and as a separate choice decide whether you want to release something in production. It's fine-tuning the user experience because in production you can see how things really work instead of in your acceptance environments. But how do you decouple deploying to production from releasing in production? Now, once your team, your customer, your partner, or the people that you work with, once they learn about we can do features per sprint, we can build something. They would want to see you deliver something at the end of the sprint. That's not always easy because how would you do that? Well, the team might decide let's do feature branching because then each part of the team or separate teams can work individually in an isolated manner and they can build their software and complete it before they deploy it to production. Well, that's good, but in reality, it's not that easy. So you would want to have a branching and merging strategy to facilitate working with separate features that are being developed. Now, one of the ways to do that is by using Git flow. And in this diagram, you can see how the different branches work. There's a couple of branches that we need to work on, but once you start building a new feature, you will create additional feature branches where the work is being collected as part of the branch before it's being merged to the dev branch and from there eventually to main. This is one of the approaches that you could use. The big advantage here is that you can develop your features on separate branches and you get to decide when it's time for you to merge back to the point where you want to release this or build it and deploy it first. Now there are easier ways, more simple ways to do this. For example, if you don't have all the additional branches, just a main branch, you could do trunk-based development or even GitHub flow, which are almost similar, but slightly different in the way from where you release into your environments. Now, whatever you choose, this is all, this is probably what you want to use. But in reality, once you start using it, we've seen companies and teams where the teams go on feature branches, but the feature branches hardly ever disappear. They are long-lived, so they are working for many months even on a separate branch. And that's not really the idea of why you would want to have a feature branch, because if you frequently go back to your main branch, you don't have the big pile-up of all these new features and functionality and the difficulties of merging it back and resolving all the conflicts. So having short-lived feature branches is much nicer. But the team might say, if we build something and it's not completed yet, then we can't really merge it back to main, because as soon as we put it to main, it goes out as deployed, but once it's deployed, it's released, so we can't really deliver value because it needs to be finished first. And it's too big to be finished in a single sprint. So, it's really hard and we just wait till it's finally done. Well, this is something that we need to address. All right, so what would you want to do? One solution here is to make it possible to deploy something, but to choose whether you want to activate it, yes or no. Well, the simplest way to do that is by using an if statement. So an if statement evaluates whether your code that you are deploying, that might be new, when that is being activated. and it uses a feature that is checked whether it's enabled, yes or no. So if you're building a new search page or a search algorithm that you want to apply, you could say, okay, that's a new feature, it has a name, and we will check if the feature is enabled to activate that new feature or not. So that's a decision that you can make once it's in a particular environment. Now, if you do this, then you can use feature branches to isolate your work on different repository branches, but you can use additional feature flags to go back to the trunk-based development, because if you make sure that the code in your your main branch is high quality, you can always deploy from your main branch, because the new things will be protected by these if statements that allow you to choose whether you want to activate that code in production or not. Now, this is kind of like in this picture here, right? So the boat is already almost finished, might not be, but it's already deployed in the place where it should be. But only once it's ready, then you can choose to release it. And that's by opening the gate and allowing you to actually start sailing your ship. But this option, the decoupling of deployment and release, is kind of what we're looking for with the feature flags. Now, why would you want that? Well, first of all, you can use code branches. The if statement introduces branches of the code flow instead of the repository branches. Then you can use both together. A simple form of switching it on and off allows you to control whether your functionality is being used. And there's a variety of reasons why you would want to do that. For example, we'll talk about testing in production, because going to production is not that scary anymore, because you get to decide if the new things are being used or not. It's about flighting, testing whether something will work. It's even an instant kill switch. If something doesn't really work and it behaves badly, you can instantly turn it off again without having to redeploy or roll back to a previous version. And also you can decide that you want to have a certain audience see new features, whereas other people will not use the new features. So it gives you a lot of options once you start using feature flags. Now, to show a little bit about how this works, if you have the regular program flow from left to right with the code that you have, you might want to build a new feature. And this new feature is going to be part of the code base, and it can replace the old. It might also be that there is no original implementation, but if you deploy it like this, then if you would want to go back, then you can't really go back because the new code has replaced the old code. So there is only one version, it's the latest version. If it doesn't work, we need to go back. Now, this is all or nothing, and this is very scary, and this is where you would want to have multiple environments and very carefully go from one environment to the next. Well, that's I would say, the old style, and it's not really as agile as we would want in DevOps. So let's not do this. Let's do it with the feature flag and the conditional part of code. So in this case, we have existing logic. We want to build a new feature. There might be an original implementation, or it could be something completely new. That's kind of your use case. But if we start building the new feature, we would create this additional flow of the logic that branches off at an if statement. So the if statement decides whether we continue the program flow as usual through the original code, or if we evaluate and go through the new feature. So that new feature could be fully implemented, but also it could be partially implemented, not ready yet for production. But that doesn't really matter, because as long as you make sure that the evaluation at the if statement always continues the original flow, then you should be okay. So you can even deploy partially implemented new pieces of functionality at the end of your sprint without having to wait until it's really finished. So you can still do all the testing that you would want to do on your application, even with incomplete code. Just make sure it's behind a feature flag. Now the feature flag, it's also called a toggle router, a feature toggle, so there's many names for the same thing. Now, this is what will happen. You have your original flow, you decide to use the new feature, it's now ready for release, so the flow starts changing instead of going straight. We'll sort of make the original feature inactive by saying, okay, it now evaluates to a true. So the if statement takes the new code branch, goes into the new feature code, we'll execute that, and we're good to go. If we want to revert, just make sure that we toggle the if statement to evaluate to false again, and we'll have the original feature again. Afterwards, you can get rid of the original code if that's no longer useful. Get rid of the feature toggle, the toggle router, and make sure that we have a clean path of code again. And this is where, after initial deployment and release, at a later stage, you will clean up feature flags again. And this is important, and we will get back to that. Now, so important to stress that your flags are released or used at 3 moments. Once it's deployed as code, then it says configuration to switch from a deployment to a release, and later on it's being cleaned again to make sure that you don't have all these if statements all over your code. Now, if you look for this, and there's an article by Martin Fowler that says there's 4 categories of feature flags. There's the one that are related to release that we've talked about so far, but there's also operational feature flags that are more about during operations. If you see operational behavior that you want to influence, you can also use a feature flag for that. An example would be there's caching, but we want to turn it on or off because of circumstances. That's something that is operational. The kill switch is also there. So if you see something that is happening that's behaving badly, you could turn on a feature or turn off a feature completely by using this operations feature flag. Now there's the ones that are more about experimenting, where you can say, okay, let's try something. Let's see how this behaves. Let's see what the users think of this. So those are more experimental in nature. And then you have the permission-based flags that are more, are you part of the group of users that are allowed to use this new feature? So it could be, for example, testing with an audience that is signed up as a beta user for the new feature. So there's an opt-in model, and you want to see, are these people allowed to see it? Or it might just be alpha functionality that you want to test out with a very select group of people. Could be your own team, where they need to be authenticated with certain accounts in order to be allowed to see the new feature. Now, feature management becomes a thing, because if you have the if statement in place, the evaluation of the if statement should be influenced, because you want to decide when it should evaluate to true or false. Now, if you have your application logic with a feature toggle in there, you have this separate thing that, let's call it a feature service. And this thing is not a web service. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. But that's responsible for evaluating and influencing the feature flags and the feature toggles that you have. There's usually a management UI, a user interface, where somebody can say, okay, I want to change this. The UI can also be a command line interface, a CLI, that allows you to set new values or set new conditions or criteria that are used for the evaluation of the flag. That could use some rules that are in the evaluation. For example, a certain percentage of evaluations will go to true, some to go to false, which is more of an experimenting kind of thing, where you could say, okay, 10% of the people will see this. Now, though, that's a particular rule, and the settings are about what is the percentage. So that's 10 in this particular example. Now, once you have this, then you start reasoning about the feature itself. What is the context? How is it being used? How does that vary per environment? Now, this evaluation might be a bit more complex than just binary. It might be a few things that come together. So, for example, there's 3 environments mentioned here. The canary one, and we'll get back to canary one, but it's very early to see, early attempts to see if it works at all. Then we have the early adopters, which might be for a small audience, but not everyone. General availability at the end is about the availability for everyone. So that's the largest audience. And you can see that you can influence the features per environment. You can decide what is turned on. If we're doing the canary release, we might turn on everything. Whereas in general availability, we might want to turn on just one at the beginning and gradually include other features. But this is how you can vary based on the context. Now, some things that you would need if you start using feature management. First thing is that you need an in-process service for evaluation, because the values can change and it needs to be evaluated based on the rules, based on the settings. So there might be a lot of filters there for customization. Now, the other thing is that you would externalize the storage of the key value pairs and also the management UI, so the management plane. You would want to keep that outside of your application. The worst thing that could happen is that your application is unresponsive because you turned on a feature, but because the management UI is inside your application, you can't even access the management UI anymore, so you can't turn off the feature. So by externalizing that, it's much better to have influence of your application outside of it. Now, there's a variety of tools and platforms that will help you build these things. I suggest, to not invent the wheel yourself, but rely on products or libraries that are out there. There are some commercial products like Launch Darkly, Bullet Train, Unleash. Those are very popular ones. And there's from Microsoft, there's a platform as a service offering, Azure App Configuration. It's not just about configuration, it's also about the feature management as part of configuration. There's a couple of application frameworks that allow you to build things. There's older ones at the bottom and more modern ones at the top. Personally, we've used Microsoft.NET feature management quite a few times, and it really nicely ties into the .NET configuration system, which can also be combined with Azure App Configuration. So if you're running software in the Microsoft ecosystem, that might be a very nice combination, but all the other ones are valid as well. But it's easy to build in all these switches, the feature toggles that allow you to switch things on and off. But what happens once you do? And this is where you need to do more than just build the if statements and have the facilities for feature management. You must have instrumentation in order to be able to monitor what your application is doing, to monitor its health, and to get metrics from the performance behavior of your application. And performance meaning, how much memory is being used, what are their average response times, are we still in good shape? So that's usually combined with some health information. Now, you need to have this bit of telemetry to see the effect of switching on and off the feature toggles. That's when you can really decide, are we getting better now, or are we degrading in the performance of our application? So you need to have this in place. And do remember, once you practice DevOps and you get these dashboards and you get the logging, tracing, and the metrics in place, there is more than just looking at the absence of errors, because it might just be that there are no errors. But if, for example, the number of sales in your web shop go from this steady number that it's usually at a few sales per hour all the way down to 0, that might just be an indication that something is not right, even though there are no errors, because your exception handling could be taking care of all the exceptions that are taking place, but still we can't manage, nobody manages to complete any sales. And there's a nice error page, no exceptions in the dashboard. Make sure that you look a bit further than just seeing, okay, nothing is going wrong, but are the things happening that should be happening? Now, to monitor this, you can use the telemetry to define quality gates in your process. And this is usually from a deployment pipeline where you would build in various gates that indicate how are we doing. And it could be just a single one, but usually there's a few things that you want to monitor. Is our health okay? What about the metrics of our cloud resources that we're using? And there could be other things that you want to look at, like queries on logs, for example. Do we get weird log messages now? Now, once you start deploying, you can monitor the environment that you've just deployed to for the various gates. Now, that should all be okay. And then we start using the feature toggles to switch functionality on and off. So if we switch it on, we want to see, do the gates indicate a stable state? Now, in this case, in the picture, you see that after a while, after a sort of a grace period, then we see that things are starting to go green. So the gates are passing. But you might want to have a stable condition for a longer time where we say, okay, now we see that we are always in the green and not just one or two that are a bit flaky and flipping back and forth between not passing and passing. So once you reach that state, you might say, okay, it's approved, this deployment went well and the release of the feature went well. We can now move on to the next stage, which could be a new environment or flipping on a new feature toggle. Now, it might just be that you never reach that stable state. There's always one of the gates indicating that it's not doing fine. And that might be that you say, okay, this is not a good release that we might be able to do. So we need to redeploy a fixed version and change whatever it is that we had and investigate why it didn't behave properly, fix that, redeploy and re-release with the feature toggles. So this development cycle, when you start working with feature flags, is about deploying first, releasing later. And that gives you much more autonomy. And the feature flags are the key to decoupling those two. So the deployment should also, if you start deploying a new feature that has a new feature flag in order to enable it, you should also deploy the feature flag setting to the external environment. That's important. And we also talked about how you need to clean up your flags. So the if statements and the flag definitions, so the settings, should also be removed. Typically, you would, in your backlog, put on this product backlog item or user story that says, okay, we want to create this new feature and we want to have a feature flag. So that's another product backlog item. And also we want to clean it up again. So you will never forget. And the cleaning up might be a bit lower on the backlog or on your Kanban board, but you need to do it eventually. And if you let that add up, it's more and more technical debt, much more complexity, and people will start, you will start to get to a point where it's unclear, what does this feature flag do again? And does it need to be turned on or off? Or if it's no longer useful because the new feature is always on, then you can remove the feature flag and remove the setting and never to reuse it again. Now that's so we talked about we can vary per environment. We can turn on feature toggles at every moment to release new functionality. But how do you make this work in a gradual exposure to be careful to release something? We don't want to go back to the all or nothing releases. We want to avoid it because if things go bad, everyone is affected, and we would rather start with smaller exposure, smaller effects, and if it goes bad, then it's at least to a contained environment or a contained group of people that are willing to accept that something might have happened. So that you can use two dimensions for that. One of them is the rings of deployment, where you have multiple environments, where you can increase the blast radius, the effect that you would have. And then there's the cohorts, the group of people that starts from a small group to more people to general availability of everyone. And that is also available as an opt-in model to make sure that people can decide whether they want to be part of a group, just like the rollout of new features on apps or on Windows, for example. They use both things as well, opt-in models for test groups and also deployment rings for gradually deploying to a wider audience. Now, if you combine this with the deployment rings and the feature flags, you can have these multiple environments. And the environments that are listed at the bottom are Canary, early adopters, and general availability. But these are 3 production environments. So this is all production. It's separate deployments of the environment where there's a different audience and we deploy to each of them individually. Canary is the smallest and it has a limited exposure. It might be just for your own team. And you have early adopters, which is a larger audience, but the people that want to see the new functionality first. Usually those people are opt-in on this environment and you dedicate them to there. And then finally there's general availability, and that might just be the millions of users of your application, where early adopters might just be thousands and the canary might just be tens of people. Well, if you combine this gradually deploying and starting to release across these rings of deployment, you can do the same thing in a certain environment with the feature flag. So inside of an environment, once you see that you've deployed something and it's okay, you can start gradually turning on the features. First a few or one, and then slowly expanding it as long as all the gates keep indicating that we're still good. Now, this is a nice way to not impact everything everywhere all at the same time. So this is about being careful. Now, combining this with the gates that we talked about, so we have gates at the end of a deployment to a certain stage. Are we good to go to the next environment, which is all production? Then we can use gates. And depending on your software for deployment and release, they will have some means of defining the definition of a gate. In Azure, for example, Azure DevOps, you can have these Azure Monitor gates that look for alerts. Are we suddenly getting all these alerts once we turn on a feature? Or maybe you have a certain endpoint, like a health monitoring endpoint, where you want to evaluate that endpoint to see how is it doing. There might be some metrics there, and you can even do smart queries on the metrics and see if we are degrading or improving. And improving would be good, but degrading would be a signal not to continue to the next environment. Now, with this in place, you can do testing in production. And it might sound scary at first, but if you are at this stage and you have matured and practiced with this, why not do testing in production? Because in production, you have the real features, you have real data and the scale of the data. It's the actual environment, not something like staging that resembles the production environment. You have real users and the real number of users, the real number of requests per second. So the scale is also real in production. So this is where quality assurance and user acceptance testing really matters, because this is for real. As long as you keep stuck in acceptance and keep doing things there, still you will not know what the behavior in production will be. So it's a good thing to start practicing with testing in production by using the feature flags. Now, the way to do this, again, have a plan, have a strategy, and there's a couple of common ones. So for example, we have A/B testing, where you have all the new or one version and another version, and you can start experimenting and see, okay, which version do people like better? Menu on the left, menu on the right. So that's maybe a way of how a new feature will visualize. But it can also be, we do a search algorithm for our web shop for articles and a newer search algorithm. And what do we get from feedback that the users give us? Which search algorithm they like better. Now, the other thing that you can do is dark launching, where you have this new search algorithm. You give people the original search algorithm and they see the results of that. But we also split the traffic and the flow of the code to also execute the new search engine. We don't display any results, but at least we can see what happens if we execute that code. What does the memory pressure look like? What kind of CPU usage do we see? So we can already see what would happen if we start executing that code. The user doesn't see it, so it's in the dark, but we can see the behavior behind the screens. And then finally, for canary releases is a reference to the coal mines, where they would take a little canary bird because it's very sensitive to poisonous gases. And if they see the canary faint, they knew they needed to get out of the mines to avoid people also suffocating from the poisonous gases. So canary releases are about trying things first, but at the very first sign of bad behavior, we stop and we revert to old. So that means that we gradually flip on the feature flags, but just a small percentage of users or in the environment will see the new feature being activated. And if that works well, we slowly increase the percentage. But as soon as it behaves badly, we go back to 0 again and we evaluate why did it go wrong and what do we need to do to fix this, redeploy and reactivate our feature. So we talked about the A/B testing. This is usually done with an hypothesis, an expectation that we might have. We think that this is what will happen. That's our hypothesis. And then we start experimenting and testing it out. Here you can also do the split testing. It can be 50-50, or you can do it slightly off the center to see what will happen. So you have all these possibilities as soon as you have more intelligent feature flags. Now, we talked about dealing with technical debt already. So how to implement the feature flag and how to get rid of it later on by removing the if statement and removing the feature flag settings. But there's also the life cycle of the flag itself. So the state that is off, on, and off again. It's at the beginning, you would probably want to have a feature with logic behind it that says it's always off. So nobody can accidentally turn the feature on. That's a safe way. Especially for incomplete features, your feature flag should be of the type always off. Then later on, you can have a toggle based on rules. And there's a variety of rules that might be present in your framework or in the product that allows you to influence what the flag will do. So for example, we had talked about the percentage, where you specify the percentage, and that's how many evaluations will evaluate to true or false. But there's also ones that are for time window. And time window says, okay, for out of business hours, so after 6 o'clock in the evening till 7 in the morning, that's when we'll turn the feature on, because that's a less busy period and we can see, reduced traffic across our feature. And later on, we might slowly increase into business hours. Or it can be if you have an implementation that should be effective, for example, January 1st, midnight, that's when the feature should become available, because there's a new law that takes effect. And the law says, we need to calculate your mortgage or your tax in a different way. Already somewhere before January 1st, you can deploy your implementation with the old rules and the new rules. And this filter that gets activated exactly at January 1st midnight will just flip to the new implementation, and nobody has to stay up at midnight on New Year's Eve to do a deployment, hope that it works, that it's exactly at 12 o'clock. This is a much better way of doing this. And there's other ones where you are, part of a cohort and you evaluate, are you part of this group based on your email address once logged in, or some other criteria. It could be like a cookie in your session state for your web application, where we say, okay, yes, you signed up for the beta, so you are part of this group and your feature will be on. So that's how the toggling will be, varying in time. But afterwards, if it's no longer experimenting, if the January 1st has passed, you would turn that flag to always on, so nobody can accidentally turn it off again. And that means that if it's in that state for a couple of sprints, you can decide to put in your backlog, drag the removal of the feature flag in your sprint, accept it into the sprint, and start removing it from your code, so it's gone and it's only the new functionality. Now, there might be some smells, things that, if it smells, it might not be good. It doesn't have to be, like blue cheese, it smells, but it's still delicious. So, but it's an indication to know, okay, are we still doing the right thing here? One of them is we have so many flags, hundreds of flags, and nobody knows which one does. That shouldn't be done. If you start using a single flag in multiple places, it has a much bigger effect. For example, a feature flag that turns on some feature in the UI, but also in the backend. That's also a lot of coupling that you might want to separate. So, think of strategies again. How do we want to deal with this? If you have very fine-grained toggle as well. So there's all these nitty-gritty details that need to be turned on individually. That's usually an indication that you're no longer looking at the feature level. The features are about functionality and the things that go together and are a whole unit of this is the feature, this is what you need to deploy and activate. And also, if you start seeing that it's no longer about business value, the business features, but it's about technical capabilities. That's also maybe not the sweet spot for feature flags. So smells, look at them if you see these signs and decide whether you're still in the good. Now some pitfalls, combining feature toggles, make them dependent on one another. This feature flag works if those two are turned on as well. That's kind of very complex scenarios. So avoid those. If you have very long-lived feature flags, why are they still flags? Well, if they are never turned on again, you shouldn't be using them for too long. We talked about if you have a feature, turn thing on, but you have no monitoring. That's definitely a pitfall because you have no idea what the effect will be. So you don't want to be called by your customer saying some feature in the website is broken. And you're like, oops, we turned on the feature, but we had no idea there were no errors. So we thought we were good, but the CPU usage was at 100% and things were not going well. We talked about unseparated control, where you have your feature management inside of your application and your application does both. Not a good thing to do, and so don't step into that pitfall. You should be clear on what the feature toggle does. So even people that are working with the application but might not have built a feature should know what it does. Because as a DevOps team, everybody is doing operations, but not everybody might have built this feature. And the other thing, and there's a story on Knights Capital, you might want to search for that, on how they repurposed, so reused the feature flag. And that turned out, to hundreds of millions of loss on the stock exchange, just because a feature was already used in another part of code that they forgot about, didn't clean up, and they switched something on, but it affected something else as well. And that's when things went really bad. So best practices, don't use flags for long-lived functionality. If it's finished, turn it to always on and then later on remove it. Well, we talked about most of these, but one thing that we didn't cover yet is monitor the usage of flags. Are flags still being used? Are they being evaluated? Are they changing? So that's also a good sign to see, okay, this feature flag has been on for a couple of months now, never turned off, so we can safely remove it. And also, once you start using them, don't flip on all the things at the same time, because as an experiment, you don't know what feature flag did the bad thing if something goes bad. So turn them on one by one and then see the effect per feature flag. And if they're unrelated to one another and not complexly coupled, then you should be very confident that turning things on will always improve things unless you see otherwise. So, final things, if you have those in place, what will happen if your feature service, the externalized source, is unavailable? What do? What is the fallback that we have? Should we turn the feature on or off? So this is where you need to think about how do we fall back and make sure that's part of your design. You can start with master flags and decrease the flags later on to smaller bits. But it's better to start big and go smaller later on than too granular to begin with. And you might also want to do some conventions for the naming. So it's really clear what a feature does and that the name is descriptive and very clearly pointing to the right place. So that's it. We have a few minutes for questions and answer, and hopefully I'll be able to connect online. If you missed that opportunity, you can still reach out through Twitter at Alex Thissen is my handle, or you can send me an email at athissen@xspirit.com. So hope you enjoyed the presentation, enjoy the rest of the conference, and see you in the Q&A session. Thanks very much, and till later. Stay safe.
Hi, Alex.
Hi, Mila.
Happy to see you. I know you are
great to
at
be
the
here
airport
again.
now. Yeah. Thank you for
On
joining
my
us
way
at
there,
our conference.
Sure, thanks for having me again.
So, I have a few questions to you about your talk. First one.
Yes, sure.
Could you please give us a few best practices for using feature flagging?
Yes,
Could
best
you please
practices.
give us? Yes.
Yeah, all right. A few best practices. Well, I think that some of the things covered in the session, externalizing the feature flags, I think are very important, and also being able to change the feature flags on demand. Because if you are tied to a new deployment to toggle the feature flags, it's kind of defeating the purpose. So cleaning up afterwards so you don't leave them hanging around is also, I think, a very important thing, because otherwise your code will be littered with all these if statements, and it's very hard to find out after a while what is needed, what is already stable. So those things I think are important. And I'll repeat the always on and always off flags, which seem kind of weird. They're flags that can't be turned off or can't be turned on, but it's kind of indicating a state where we're not ready yet, or this should always be on because it's finished. And that those are the best practice, I would say, is you can search your code for places where it's like that. So if you find something that says if this feature flag, which is the always on feature flag, then you can see, okay, this is what we can remove maybe in the next iteration of a sprint.
Okay.
So just to name a few.
Yeah. And during the deployment of new releases, what will be the best scenario? Using deployment rings or feature flags?
No,
The
well,
best
my answer
scenario.
would be both. Yeah, both. Because in general, when companies or teams look at multiple environments, they usually say, okay, we have a development, a test, acceptance, and production environment. But if you look just at the production environment, that can consist of multiple environments. So physical environments that are all production. And by recognizing that, you can say, okay, so this audience is targeted to this environment, which is an early stage of where everyone is going to. And that if you have multiple of these production environments, you can use the combination with the feature flags to gradual release within each of those environments. So first you start with a small audience in a small production environment. There you can flip on all the feature flags. And then in the full production environment, which might be across the world, there you can say, okay, this is where we will go a bit slower with turning on the flags, because if we turn something on, we impact everyone. So I would go for the combination, but if it needs to be either one, I would rather have feature flags than multiple production environment or deployment rings.
Okay, thank you so much. For now, it's all my questions that I have, and I think we can move to the Discord voice chat, and you can talk with our participants there. And guys, you can answer by voice or just write the answer in Discord or in Telegram, anywhere. So please, thank you, Alex, for your time. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe. Have a good trip today.